Hey everyone, it is Friday, so that means it is time for my weekly MTG Top 10. This week, as you can see, we'll be looking at the top 10 cards in Magic's history that have the word Aether in their name. Before we talk about the list and why I decided to choose this list for this week, I wanted to give my obligatory plug to my Patreon. You can find the link in the description of this video, and by donating there, you can help make my channel better. Anyway, let's start with why I decided to go with this particular list this week. Last week, we looked at the cards that deal with Chandra. That was a top 10 list, the 10 cards featuring Chandra, and that was because of the announcement about Kaladesh, the first set in Kaladesh block. Well, when they made that announcement about Kaladesh, they also made an announcement about the small set in the same block, which will be called Aether Revolt, and it'll be released in January of 2017. Now, you may notice something about the word Aether here. It isn't exactly spelled the way it usually is in Magic, anyway, in that it lacks the character combining both the A and the E into one letter. This is called, in linguistics and paleography, a ligature. Turns out Mark Rosewater apparently hated the use of this ligature, and it will be discontinued from Aether Revolt on. And all cards with Aether in their title will actually be errated to be spelled in the more simple way that you see above in Aether Revolt. The idea is that it makes it easier for the cards to appear in search engines and so forth if they simplify the spelling, and this is sort of true. If you try to buy Magic Online cards on MTGOtrader.com, for example, and you type Aether without the ligature, you won't find anything. So I suppose I understand the change, because from now on when people do that, they will find something. That said, there are plenty of famous and powerful cards in Magic's history that have the word Aether in their name, with 43 having been printed as of the recording of this, which is mid-2016 or so. This list will look at the 10 most powerful cards with Aether in their name, and that means I will be looking at how well certain cards have done in the competitive scene. Believe it or not, such a small pool of cards, only 43 as I said, cards with Aether have had a lot of impressive finishes in competitive Magic. So let's get started with the list. At number 10, we begin with Aether Snatch. So even though cards with Aether in their name are powerful, there aren't quite 10 Aether cards that have finished in the top 8 of major Magic the Gathering tournaments. That's why here at number 10, we just have a card that is a blue staple in Commander. Being able to gain control of your opponent's most powerful spell, which this can allow you to do, whether it is a creature or something else, whether it is their commander or otherwise, is a pretty big deal, and as such, this card sees a lot of play in blue commander decks. It won't even show up in more competitive formats since it was printed in a commander set. It is only legal in Legacy and Vintage, and obviously won't quite get the job done there, but it is a sweet card for commander, and I think it deserves to be on this list, if only because it's a card you want in basically any blue commander deck. At number 9, we have our last card that never actually had a high finish at a constructed Premier event, but this card was one of the best commons in Magic 2011 and Magic 2012 drafts, and that is Aether Adept. It appeared in several draft decks that did do well at Grand Prix and Pro Tours, such as the deck that won Grand Prix Portland in 2010. Aether Adept may seem sort of innocuous, a 3-mana 2/2 that returns a creature to its owner's hand, but that's a huge tempo play. It's mana war, basically. They never print commons that are this strong anymore. Recently we had Separatist Void Mage in Magic Origins, which costs an additional mana to do the same thing with the same size body. Of course, I guess they did print Reflector Mage, but that was an uncommon and it cost 2 colors. But Aether Adept was a very good card, and it did actually show up in Constructed a little bit, even if it didn't quite ever finish highly at a Pro Tour or a Grand Prix in Constructed. This card did do well at other places. It finished highly at several Star City Games events, appearing in red, blue, green pod decks that were popular in Standard at the time. Because of the nature of these pod decks, look up Birthing Pod if you're interested, it was just a singleton card that could be tutored with the absurdly powerful pod and times where the Adept was really needed. A pod deck packing a singleton Adept showed up at Star City Games Invitational in Atlanta in 2012 and finished in second place. That would be about it for the Adept, though, after it rotated out of Standard, and it was never really heard from again. If they ever do reprint it, though, especially if they do it at Common, it will be a very good common to first pick in basically any draft format. So from here, we go to number 8, and at number 8, we have Aetherize. And from 8 on, all the cards appearing in the top 8 deck lists are at all the cards have appeared in top 8 deck lists at constructed Premier events, is what I'm trying to say, meaning Pro Tours or Grand Prix. The first on this list of Aether cards that did well at Premier events is Aetherize. This is a card that was very good at giving you a tempo advantage, as the 4 mana you spent to cast it was usually far less than whatever your opponent had to pay to replay all of their creatures. It also destroyed token decks. It didn't ever make it to a main board deck list, but its utility against aggressive decks and token decks made it a sweet sideboard card, and it finished in the top 8 of Pro Tour Dragons Maze in 2013 in the sideboard of a Patriot, also known as Red, White, and Blue, control deck. It also had other finishes at smaller scale events, but Pro Tour Dragon's Maze would be the height of Aetherize's popularity. Worth noting that this card is a pretty solid inclusion in Commander as well. So let's move on to number 7. At number 7, we have a card that is actually quite similar to Aetherize. For 1 more mana, it lets you put the creatures your opponents control on either the top of their library or the bottom of their library. Worth noting that your opponent gets to choose which, and that's not super clear in the card, but that is how it works. Like Aetherize, this card played an important role in sideboards of control decks, and the best finish Aether Spouts ever enjoyed was appearing in the sideboard of a top 8 deck at Pro Tour Dragons of Tarkir in 2015. It had a little more of an impact on the standard metagame, though, appearing in more non-Pro Tour, non-Grand Prix tournaments than Aetherize ever did. It appeared in 2 of the top 8 decks at the 2014 World Championship, and 2 of the top 8 decks at the World Magic Cup in 2014, in addition to appearing at some Star City Games events. Like Aetherize, it is also a pretty nice card for EDH decks. At number 6, we have our first non-blue card, Aether Spellbomb. Of course, it has a blue activated ability, so it may as well be blue, but we'll pretend this introduces some variety to the list. This card, like Aether Adept, was great and limited in its day, and indeed it appeared in 3 of the top 8 decks at Pro Tour Amsterdam in 2004, which was a limited event, and 2 of the top 8 decks at Pro Tour San Diego in 2004, which is also a limited event. But, unlike Aether Adept, it also had a brief moment in the sun when it actually appeared in a constructed Pro Tour Top 8, and it actually made it into the main deck at Pro Tour Berlin in 2008, which was an extended Pro Tour. The deck it was in was called Tezzerator, a deck that used Tezzeret the Seeker to win the game. It was a control deck basically built around this powerful Planeswalker, and it used Tezzeret's tutoring ability to pull out whatever the deck needed, and this included sideboarding 1 Aether Spellbomb in times of need, and having 1 in the deck too, so you could search it out whenever you need it. It never saw play again, in part because Extended soon stopped existing after 2008, but at least it had a brief moment in Constructed, in addition to being a great card in Limited. As you can see, it only had 1 Pro Tour Top 8 in Constructed, but it had 4 in Limited, so it was clearly a strong card in Limited, and it did have its brief moment in Constructed as well. So let's move to number 5. At number 5, we have the oldest card on our list, and that is Aether Burst. This card was part of the Burst cycle in Odyssey, which were all common cards that had effects that checked to see if other cards with the same name were in the graveyard. And if they were, they granted you additional effects. This is probably the best card from the cycle, although the red one, Flame Burst, was also pretty good. This card was great because if you ran 4 of them, you would frequently get to bounce 2 to 3 creatures for only 2 mana by the later part of the game, meaning that this card scaled in power level as the game went on, making it a good card in most control decks seeking to out-tempo their opponent. These sort of collect-them-all cycles are usually good and limited when you manage to hit a critical mass of the card, and as a result, people drafting Aether Burst finished in the top 8 of 2 Pro Tours, both in 2002, Pro Tour Nice and Pro Tour San Diego, both limited Pro Tours. But it also did well at constructed Pro Tours in Odyssey Block, where it finished in the top 8 of Pro Tour Osaka in 2002, in a Blue-Green Madness deck that packed 4 bursts into it, and in a Black-Blue Psychotog deck in the same top 8. More or less, the same Blue-Green Madness deck did well at Grand Prix Taipei in 2002 as well. The Burst wouldn't see much play outside of Block, but while it was in the Block, it managed to find itself in 2 of the more powerful decks in the format. So, from number 5, we go to number 4, and here we have the newest card in our list. We just saw the oldest one, here's the newest one, and it is Girapur Aether Grid, and it is in fact not blue at all. How about that? This card is a card from Magic Origins that actually depicts Kaladesh, the set that we're going to see Aether Revolt taking place in, so maybe it's somehow related to this Aether Grid. And it tells us that Aether is somehow related to artifacts on that plane. After it was printed, the grid started getting shoved into Modern Affinity deck sideboards because it gave the deck a way to win against effects like Ensnaring Bridge or other grindy matchups. It first came on the scene at World Championships in 2015 with 2 decks featuring the grid in the sideboard, making the top 10. This card is also featured in most versions of the Modern Lantern Control deck that emerged last year, just down the road from me, actually, at Grand Prix Oklahoma City. And the Lantern Control deck mainboarded one and used it as one of its main win conditions. Since the deck runs several artifacts that shut down the opponent's, like Ensnaring Bridge, and controls what the opponent draws with the help of Lantern of Insight, Girapur Aether Grid gave you a way to slowly bleed your opponent to death if you weren't able to mill them. 2 more Affinity decks that featured the card in its sideboard finished in the top 8 in Grand Prix Pittsburgh in 2015. The notoriously unbalanced top 8 of Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch in 2016, which was a modern Pro Tour that featured 6 Eldrazi decks, did have 2 Affinity decks in the top 8, and both of them ran Aether Grids in the sideboard. The card will likely continue to see play in Modern Lantern Control decks and Modern Affinity decks, at least in the sideboard, so it will likely add to its resume in the future, although there won't be any more Pro Tour top 8s because Modern is not a Pro Tour format anymore. But there's still Grand Prix, so it sits at number 4. What do we have at number 3? We have Unravel the Ether. Here we have another card that was primarily a sideboard card, but when it was in standard, it was one of the best sideboard cards you could have, and as a result, it was in sideboards the whole time it was in standard, racking up some pretty impressive showings. The reason it was so good is because it was a format that featured removal spells like Silk Wrap and Banishing Light with her enchantment base, and if you could remove the enchantment, you got whatever they removed back. Not to mention important enchantment creatures like Courser of Krufix. It was important against, especially good anyway, against the blue-red and Soul Artifact deck that emerged when both Theros Block and Magic Origins were in standard. This is because it could shuffle both Hangerback Walker and an Ensoul Artifacted Darksteel Citadel back into its owner's library, which was a pretty big blow to the deck. 3 decks finished in the top 8 of Pro Tour Journey to Nyx in 2014 that sported copies of Unravel the Ether in its sideboard, and the deck that won Pro Tour Khans of Tarkir also made use of the card, as did a deck that finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Moscow in 2014, and decks at several other Grand Prix did well that year as well, that happened to have Unravel the Ether in it, such as at Grand Prix Stockholm, Grand Prix Madrid, and Grand Prix San Antonio. It continued to be as good as long as it was in standard, which also included several appearances in 2015, 2 top 8s at Grand Prix Manila, 1 at Grand Prix Copenhagen, 3 at Grand Prix San Diego, and 2 at Grand Prix London. Basically, the card got shoved into the sideboard of any deck that had green in it, as long as it was in standard, making this card a staple for green sideboards. The last 2 cards we will look at won't be exclusively sideboard cards, and they have rather impressive resumes. At number 2, we have Aether Ling. Aether Ling is a cool card because it was a callback to one of Magic's greatest control win condition creatures ever, Morphling. And it didn't disappoint, being a key card in standard the entire time it was legal there. What made it so good was that it could do so many things. It could be a good blocker if it needed to be. It could be a good attacker if it needed to be. It could make itself unblockable, and it could dodge any removal that was aimed at it. This made it for a very difficult to deal with win condition and control, and as a result, Aether Ling saw a lot of play, and it enabled control decks to be one of the strongest kind of decks you could play in standard when Return to Ravnica block was around, and in Return to Ravnica block constructed. Aether Ling was so powerful, in fact, that 5 decks finished in the top 8 of Pro Tour Dragon's Maze, in 2013, and 5 of those 8 decks featured Aether Ling, and all were, of course, control decks, and that was a block-constructed event. Aether Ling made a good showing at that year's World Championship, too, showing up as a win condition of black deck that finished in the top 4. In a control deck, rather, that finished in the top 4. Aether Ling isn't a card that only saw success in block, though. It also showed up at a standard Pro Tour in 2013, Pro Tour Theros, where one was featured in the main deck in the top 8, and the deck that won it all ran 2 Aether Lings in the sideboard. It would continue to find success in standard, showing up in Esper control decks that were one of the best decks in standard of 2013. 2 decks running Aether Ling as a win condition finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Louisville that year, and 1 deck featuring the new Morphling finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Santiago. Aether Ling achieved several other Grand Prix top 8s in standard that year, including at Grand Prix Vienna, 2 at Grand Prix Shizuoka, and the deck that won it all at Grand Prix Vancouver. Success continued in 2014 as Esper control decks continued to dominate with 3 top 8s at Grand Prix Melbourne, 3 at Grand Prix Cincinnati, including a win, and 1 at Grand Prix Phoenix. Aether Ling hasn't found any success out of block or standard, but I think it was a dominant enough card in the most dominant deck in the standard of its time, and that gave it a pretty impressive resume. As you can see, that what that all comes down to is 7 Pro Tour top 8s and 12 Grand Prix top 8s. But this resume actually isn't impressive enough to make it number 1. Can you guess what number 1 is? You probably can if you're thinking about Aether cards, because at number 1 we have Aether Vial, another card that's not blue. How about that? Aether Vial is probably not a surprise to see at number 1 for most of you, especially if you play Eternal formats. Aether Vial is probably one of the most powerful things an aggro deck can do with 1 mana, and over the course of the game, Aether Vial ends up saving a player a massive amount of mana, while allowing creatures to come into play at instant speed and make them uncounterable. So that's really the key here, in addition to saving you mana. The card was so good it got banned in the old extended format, and that shows you just how powerful it was. It appears in most aggro decks in Modern and Legacy because it is so powerful, and it's compiled an impressive resume over several years. The Vial first showed up on the competitive scene in 2004, where it was part of one of the most maligned decks in the history of Magic, Ravager Affinity. If you didn't play back then, think about the outrage about the Modern Eldrazi decks from a few months ago that resulted in a banning. Then multiply that by about 10, and you get how people felt about Ravager Affinity. The deck was completely broken. Tons of cards ended up having to be banned in Standard as well, but Aether Vial only ended up getting banned in Extended, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Pro Tour Kobe in 2004 was a Mirrodin block constructed event, and this was where Aether Vial made its first foray into a top 8 list. It would be far from its last, though. Aether Vial and Affinity were so strong that they immediately impacted Extended as well. Extended was a format that was sort of a precursor to Modern that had rotations, but they were very infrequent. And the deck that won Pro Tour Columbus in 2004, an Extended Pro Tour, ran Aether Vial. This should also sort of remind you of the Eldrazi deck, because those were all cards that were printed in a very new set, but immediately impacted Modern, and that's kind of what happened with the Affinity deck as well. After seeing what the Vial could do in an Affinity deck, other deck builders started to realize the card was good in any creature-based deck, and it started appearing in tons of winning lists. 3 decks finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Boston in 2005, which was another extended event, and none of them were Affinity decks this time. They were just other creature-based decks that made use of the card. In fact, 2 of them were combo decks that ran the Vial so they could play their combo pieces, which were creatures, without having to worry about them being countered by a blue player. The combo was to gain infinite life. Then, Goblin decks latched onto the card too. Goblin decks were already pretty strong, but this pushed them over the top. And 2 running Aether Vial finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Seattle of 2005, as did another life gain combo deck featuring Aether Vial. 2 Goblin decks running the Vial finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Philadelphia that same year, and a life gain combo deck finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Lille. But this would be the last extended event that the Vial would finish in the top 8 of, because it got banned from extended in September of 2005, because it was making an imbalanced format where basically any creature-based deck shoved 4 of them into it. Due to this exile, the Vial did disappear for a couple years before enterprising deck builders realized the Vial was probably good enough for Legacy, and it top-8'd its first Legacy event in a Goblin deck at Grand Prix Columbus in 2007. Legacy events didn't occur with any regularity, though, just as they don't really today, and there is another large gap in Aether Vial's resume. Funnily enough, it reemerged in 2010 at another Legacy Grand Prix in Columbus, this time emerging in a new tribal aggro deck, Merfolk. Another Merfolk deck running the Vial finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Providence in 2011, and in 2012, a Goblin deck running the Vial finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Atlanta. And these are all Legacy events. In 2013, 3 of the top 8 decks at Grand Prix Strasbourg ran Aether Vial: a Merfolk deck, a Hate Bears deck, which was called Death and Taxes at the time. Aether Vial would finally break into Modern in 2015, where it started showing up in Modern Merfolk decks, where it remains today, and it had a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Omaha that year and 3 at Grand Prix Copenhagen in true Merfolk decks, hard to say, and a Hate Bears deck. Also in 2015, a Merfolk deck running the Vial finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Oklahoma City, and a Hate Bear deck running it finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Pittsburgh. Aether Vial continues to be played in creature-based decks in Modern and Legacy, and it will likely add more top 8 finishes to its impressive number of 24 Grand Prix top 8s. Well, that does it for this week's list. What do you think of the list this week? Did I leave any Aether cards out that deserve to be here? Did I overrate any? Do you have any ideas for future top 10s? Let me know those things in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.